A chunk of gray granite sits on a mantelpiece in Bozeman, Montana. It is the size of a man's fist. It has no inscription. It has no polish. It is not decorative in any conventional sense. It is just stone, cool in summer, cold in winter, ordinary in every way that the eye can measure. But this stone is not ordinary. It has not been ordinary since 1887, when a 17-year-old boy pulled it from a quarry east of his family's homestead and carried it home in a wagon his dead father had built. This stone was part of something, part of a pillar that weighed more than 3,000 pounds and stood from floor to ceiling in the center of a one-room cabin in Gallatin County, Montana Territory. A pillar that held heat for 14 hours after the fire died. A pillar that kept every corner of that cabin at the same temperature, while neighbors froze 6 feet from stoves that could not reach their far walls. 19 people survived the worst Arctic outbreak in 40 years of Montana history because of that pillar. 4 others in cabins without it did not survive. One of them was 8 years old. He died in his sleep, wrapped in blankets, 20 feet from a roaring fire that could not bridge the distance between the corner where the stove sat and the corner where he lay. This is the story of how that pillar came to be. It begins not with the boy who built it, but with the man who taught him why it mattered. A man who crossed an ocean carrying knowledge more valuable than gold. A man who died before he could use it. And it begins with a question that most people never think to ask. Why does a cabin with a stove in the corner still have cold walls on the opposite side? The answer to that question saved 19 lives. But we will get there. First, we go to Sweden. Dalarna is a province in central Sweden where winters arrive in October and do not leave until April. The forests are dense with pine and birch. The lakes freeze solid enough to drive a horse across. The wind comes down from the mountains carrying cold that settles into your bones and stays there like a tenant who refuses to pay rent but also refuses to leave. For 500 years, the people of Dalarna heated their homes with kakelugnar. The word does not translate easily into English. The closest approximation is masonry stove, but that is like calling a cathedral a building. Technically accurate, spiritually insufficient. A kakelugn was a monument. It stood 5 feet tall, sometimes 6, sometimes taller. It was built from brick and ceramic tile weighing a ton or more rising from the floor, like something permanent. Something that belonged to the house the way a chimney belongs to a house, or a foundation belongs to a house. You did not move a kakelugn, you built a house around it. The principle behind it was simple enough that a child could understand it. The execution required generations of accumulated knowledge that no child could possess. Here's the principle. Iron forgets heat in minutes. You have felt this yourself. Touch a cast iron skillet that has been off the burner for 20 minutes. It is warm but cooling fast. Touch it again in an hour. Cold. Iron absorbs heat quickly and releases it quickly. It is eager to take warmth and equally eager to give it away. A generous material, you might say, but generosity in a stove is not a virtue. You want your stove to be selfish. You want it to hold on to heat the way a miser holds on to money. Reluctantly, slowly, only releasing it when it absolutely must. Stone is that miser. Brick is that miser. Ceramic tile is that miser. They absorb heat slowly, yes, which means you must be patient while they warm. But once warm, they release that heat with agonizing reluctance. Hours pass and the stone is still giving. Half a day passes and the tiles are still warm to the touch. A full night passes and the room is still comfortable. That is what a kakelugn did. You built a fire inside it in the evening. A proper fire, hot and intense, lasting perhaps 2 hours. The flames roared through channels designed to snake through the masonry, surrendering their heat to brick and tile and mortar at every turn. By the time the smoke exited the chimney, it had given up nearly everything. Most of the fire's energy lived not in the air, not in the smoke, not in the flames, but in the stone itself. Then you let the fire die. You closed the damper. You went to bed. And while you slept, the kakelugn did what kakelugnar had done for 5 centuries. It remembered. It released the heat it had stored slowly, gently in every direction, filling the room with warmth that persisted until morning. One fire, one evening. Warmth until dawn. The Americans who came to Montana Territory in the 1870s and 1880s did not know any of this. They brought what they knew, which was cast iron. Box stoves and pot-belly stoves and Franklin stoves and cook stoves. Iron that heated fast and cooled fast. Iron that demanded continuous feeding. Iron that sat in a corner because corners were where stoves went, because that is where their fathers had put stoves, because that is where their grandfathers had put stoves. Nobody questioned it. Nobody thought about whether there was a better way. They just did what had always been done. And every winter they shivered. The corner near the stove might reach 45 degrees on a brutal night. The far wall, 20 feet away, might hold at 8 degrees, a differential of nearly 40 degrees within a single room. Families slept packed together in the warm corner, piled like cordwood, themselves sharing body heat because the stove could not provide enough. They burned wood continuously through the night. Someone had to wake every 2 hours to feed the fire. If the fire died, the cold came, and the cold in Montana did not negotiate. It simply took. That is the world Niels Allberg entered when he brought his family from Dalarna to Gallatin County in 1881. Niels Allberg was not a farmer. That is the first thing to understand about him because it explains everything that followed. He was a Kakalugan builder, a master of thermal mass, a man who had spent 31 years learning the principles that 5 centuries of Swedish craftsmen had perfected. He could look at a room and know, without measuring, where the heat would gather and where the cold would hide. He could feel mortar between his fingers and tell you whether it would hold at 300 degrees or crack at 200. He could design a flue channel in his head, calculating the path that smoke should travel to surrender the maximum heat to the surrounding stone. This was his gift. This was his inheritance. Not land, not money, not social position, but knowledge. The kind of knowledge that lives in your hands as much as in your mind. The kind that cannot be learned from books alone, because books cannot teach you the feel of brick properly seated, or the sound of mortar at the right consistency, or the way fire moves through a channel that has been designed by someone who truly understands what fire wants. He came to Montana because rumors of farmland and opportunity had reached even the remote villages of Dalarna. The American West promised space freedom soil that had never been plowed, a future that the old country with its rigid social orders and limited land could not offer. So Niels packed what mattered: his tools, his wife Astrid, who had the quiet strength of women who had survived Swedish winters without complaint, his son Stellan, who was 10 years old and already learning to hold a trowel, his daughter Lana, who was 6 years old and already asking questions that had no easy answers, and his journal, leather-bound, worn at the corners, filled with cramped handwriting in a mixture of Swedish and English. In that journal lived everything: measurements and calculations and diagrams that captured 5 centuries of thermal engineering, flue ratios and firebox dimensions, and heat capacity formulas in notation that only family could decipher. It was in every meaningful sense a book of inherited wisdom, a treasure that fit in a coat pocket. Montana greeted them with beauty and indifference. The mountains were magnificent. The valleys were fertile. The winters were lethal. They claimed 160 acres of homestead land in Gallatin County and began the brutal work of turning wilderness into something resembling a farm. Shelter first, crops second, animals third. That was the order. That was always the order. Survival before comfort, necessity before desire. Niels built a cabin, a good cabin, solid and weather-tight, with log walls and a shingled roof and a floor that did not let the wind through. He installed a corner stove because that is what was available, what the trading post in town carried, what every other homesteader used. It was not what he wanted. It was not what he knew was possible, but it was what the moment required. He told himself that later, when there was time, when there were resources, when the farm was established, he would build what he really wanted to build: a central thermal mass, a pillar of stone standing in the exact middle of the cabin with a ring firebox embracing its base, heating the stone from every direction simultaneously. A system that would radiate warmth to every corner equally. No hot spots, no cold spots, just warmth everywhere for hours after the flames died. Later, when there was time. If you are over 60 years old, you know what that word means. Later is the most dangerous word in the English language. Later means never in a voice that sounds like eventually. Later is the lie we tell ourselves about the things that matter most. We will get to them later. We will build them later. We will say the things we need to say and do the things we need to do later. Niels Allberg had 6 Montana winters to build his pillar. 6 winters of watching his family huddle near the corner stove while frost formed on the far walls. 6 winters of burning wood continuously through the night and still waking to cold that bit exposed skin. 6 winters of knowing exactly how to fix the problem and not fixing it because there was always something more urgent. Fences to mend, crops to plant, animals to tend. A homestead does not build itself, and a man cannot do everything at once. But he prepared. That much must be said for him. 2 years before his death, he discovered a quarry 8 miles east of the homestead. Good stone, dense stone, granite with the weight and thermal properties that his engineering mind recognized immediately as ideal for what he planned. He began hauling loads when time permitted, stockpiling granite near the cabin, waiting for the season when he could finally begin construction. He designed the pillar in his journal. Every measurement, every ratio, every principle. 3 feet in diameter, floor to ceiling. Ring firebox at the base, allowing flames to embrace the entire circumference. Central flue rising through the core, extracting additional heat from the smoke as it passed. Minimum weight for 12 hours of radiation. He calculated it all, drawing on 31 years of training and 500 years of inherited knowledge. The design was complete. The stone was waiting. The knowledge was ready. The builder was not. On a quiet evening in December of 1886, Niels sat beside the corner stove with young Stellan repairing a neighbor's failing cast iron fitting that had cracked in the cold. The cabin was warm near their corner and freezing everywhere else. Astrid and Lana huddled beneath blankets on the far side of the room, their breath visible in the lamplight. Niels held a piece of granite in one hand and a piece of iron in the other. He weighed them, turning each over, feeling the density of one against the hollowness of the other. Iron forgets heat in minutes, he told Stellan. Stone remembers heat for hours. The more stone, the longer it remembers. A fire in the corner heats one direction. The corner walls take half the heat and the room takes half. But a fire wrapped around stone heats the stone from every direction. And stone in the center of a room radiates to every corner equally. No hot spots, no cold spots, just warmth everywhere for hours after the flames die. Stellan was 15 years old when he heard those words. He did not fully understand them. The physics were beyond him. The engineering was abstract. But the words themselves lodged somewhere deep, the way a father's words lodge in a son's memory, waiting for the moment when understanding catches up to recollection. He did not know that in little more than a year he would need those words more than he had ever needed anything. April 1887. The spring thaw arrived 3 weeks early. Snow that should have melted gradually over 6 weeks liquefied in 9 days. Streams became rivers. Rivers became walls of churning water, carrying everything in their path. The seasonal creek that ran half a mile from the Allberg homestead transformed into something unrecognizable. A monster that devoured its banks and spread across the valley floor with the casual violence of nature that has no interest in human plans. Niels and Astrid were 8 miles east when it happened, hauling granite from the quarry. The very stone that Niels planned to use for the pillar he had designed but never built. The wagon was heavy with a fresh load. The horses were tired from the long pull. The road followed the creek too closely, tracing a path that had been safe for 6 years and was not safe today. Nobody saw exactly what happened. The evidence told the story afterward, the way evidence always does when there are no witnesses. A section of road had collapsed into the swollen creek. The wagon had gone over. The horses had somehow broken free and were found 2 miles downstream alive but injured. Niels and Astrid were found 3 days later, a quarter mile apart, tangled in debris where the floodwaters had deposited them. They died hauling the stone for the pillar they never built. If there is a crueler irony in the history of Montana homesteading, I have not heard it told. Stellan Allberg was 17 years old. His sister Lana was 12. They had each other. They had 160 acres of homestead land that required a grown man's labor to work. They had a cabin with a corner stove that could not heat its far walls. They had a dog named Odin, a gray Norwegian elk hound who had belonged to Niels and followed him everywhere. Odin had waited 3 days at the spot where the road collapsed. 3 days in rain and mud, staring at the churning water, waiting for his master to come back. Until Stellan came to bring him home. Now the dog pressed against Stellan's leg at the funeral, as if afraid the boy might disappear too. The funeral was small. The community that gathered was sparse but genuine in the ways that frontier communities always were. People who did not have much still came with what they could offer. Old Tobias Angstrom was there. He was 71 years old, a Swedish carpenter who had known Niels in the old country, who had made the same journey to Montana seeking the same opportunities. His English was better than Niels's had been. His hands still steady despite his age, his eyes still sharp with the accumulated wisdom of a man who had paid attention to life for 7 decades. He spoke words in Swedish over the graves, words that most of the American attendees did not understand, words that Stellan and Lana understood perfectly because the language of grief needs no translation when it is your own. Pastor Jeremiah Crane offered prayers. They felt hollow in the spring wind, not because the pastor did not mean them, but because words spoken over fresh graves always feel insufficient. Language was not designed to carry the weight of 2 children standing alone in the world. And at the back of the small gathering, arms crossed, watching the orphans with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite calculation, stood Harlan Whitmore. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Harlan Whitmore. Not as a villain, not as a greedy land baron twirling his mustache. That would be too simple, and simple villains belong in stories told to children. Whitmore was 54 years old. He was the wealthiest rancher in Gallatin County. He owned 3,000 acres and employed a dozen men and had carved success from the Montana wilderness through 30 years of relentless work and sharp business instincts. He had lost a wife to fever 8 years prior. He had raised 3 children alone. He knew what hardship looked like because he had stared it down himself. He was also a practical man. Impractical men sometimes confuse practicality with wisdom. They look at a situation, calculate the odds, and assume that anyone who defies those odds is a fool. Whitmore looked at 2 orphan children on 160 acres of land that required adult labor, and he calculated. He calculated that they would fail. He calculated that winter would break them. He calculated that by spring they would be desperate enough to sell. The Allberg land sat between 2 parcels Whitmore had been wanting to connect for years. This was not coincidence. This was the geometry of ambition meeting the geography of opportunity. He approached after the burial. His boots were polished. His coat was brushed. His condolence was practiced. He had attended many funerals. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. His voice carried the right tone. Just enough warmth, just enough gravity. "Your father was a hard worker, stubborn but hardworking." Then the warmth faded and the business began. "You children cannot work this land alone," Whitmore said. 160 acres requires a man's labor. You are 17. Your sister is 12. Winter will come again. The cabin your father built cannot keep you warm. I have seen how he positioned that stove in the corner, and I have seen how your far walls frost over by morning." Stellan remained silent. Lana's hand found his. Her fingers were trembling, but her grip was fierce. "I am prepared to make you a fair offer," Whitmore continued. $40 for the land and everything on it. You can stay through summer, find positions in town, make arrangements. By winter, you will be settled somewhere safe, somewhere warm. $40 for 160 acres of Montana homestead land, for the graves of 2 parents who had crossed an ocean to claim it, for the cabin and the outbuildings and the fences and the stockpiled granite in the years of labor that had turned wilderness into something that approached home. $40. No, Stellan said. The word hung in the spring air like something solid. Whitmore's expression flickered. Not anger, not yet. Surprise. He was not a man accustomed to hearing that word from anyone, let alone a 17-year-old orphan standing over fresh graves with nothing to his name but a failing homestead and a dog. "No," Stellan said again. "The land is not for sale." And now Whitmore's voice hardened, just slightly, just enough to reveal the steel beneath the practiced sympathy. "Boy, you are 17 years old. You have no family, no resources, no skills that matter out here. Your father was a stove builder from Sweden. What do you know about farming Montana soil? What do you know about surviving Montana winter? $40 is generous, more than generous." Stellan looked at this fresh grave where his parents lay beneath dirt that was still dark and loose. He looked at the mountains still capped with snow that would melt and flow and feed the creeks that ran too fast this spring, the same creeks that had taken everything. He looked at Odin sitting patient and loyal beside him, the dog who had waited 3 days for a master who would never return. "The land is not for sale," he said a third time. Then he turned and walked away. Lana's hand still in his, Odin padding silently at their heels. 3 figures moving across the Montana landscape toward a cabin that could not keep them warm in a future that everyone said was impossible. Harlan Whitmore watched them go. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed with the particular frustration of a man who has made what he considers a reasonable offer and been refused by someone he considers unreasonable. The boy will learn, Whitmore said to no one in particular. Winter teaches lessons that pride cannot survive. He mounted his horse and rode away toward 3,000 acres of land and a dozen employees and a fortune that could buy anything in Gallatin County, anything except a 17-year-old boy's refusal to give up what his parents had died for. The weeks that followed the funeral blurred together in a haze of grief and labor. There was livestock to tend, a garden to plant, fences to repair after the flooding, a cabin to maintain. Work that had been shared among four was now divided between two, and neither Stellan nor Lana had ever carried such weight alone. Stellan worked from before dawn until after dark. His hands blistered, then calloused. His shoulders ached with constant labor. He fell asleep each night in the chair beside the cold corner stove because walking to his bed required energy he did not have. He was 17 years old, doing the work of a grown man, carrying the responsibilities of a father grieving parents he had not had time to properly mourn. Lana took over the household with the fierce determination of someone who refuses to acknowledge that the task might be too large. Cooking, cleaning, mending, washing. Their mother had managed these things with graceful efficiency. Now they fell to a 12-year-old girl who had to stand on a stool to reach the kitchen shelves. She did not complain. She did not cry where Stellan could see. She simply worked day after day, holding the household together through sheer will. Odin divided his time between them. Mornings with Stellan in the fields pressing close to his leg, the way he had pressed close to Neil's. Afternoons with Lana at the cabin lying near the door like a sentry. Evenings stretched before the corner stove that provided minimal warmth to minimal space, the three of them together, in the quiet that fills a house when the people who should be there are not. It was during one of those evenings, 3 weeks after the funeral, that Lana found the journal. She had been organizing their father's belongings, a task she had avoided as long as she could because touching his clothes and his tools and his papers meant accepting that he would never touch them again. But necessity demanded it. His clothes needed to be stored or repurposed. His tools needed to be inventoried. His papers needed to be sorted. The journal was buried beneath a stack of old letters from relatives in Sweden. Leather-bound, worn at the corners, filled with Niels Allberg's cramped handwriting in a mixture of Swedish and English. She recognized it immediately. She had seen her father writing in it by candlelight on winter evenings, recording measurements and calculations and ideas that he would explain to anyone who would listen and that almost no one understood. Stellan, she said quietly, look at this. She carried the journal to where her brother sat slumped in exhaustion. Odin raised his head from his paws, watching as Lana opened the pages and began to read. Her Swedish was better than Stellan's, despite her younger age. Languages came to her the way numbers came to her naturally, as if she had been designed to receive them. Central thermal mass, she translated slowly. The pillar must stand in the exact center of the room, 3 feet in diameter, floor to ceiling, minimum weight for 12 hours of radiation. Ring firebox at the base. Flames embrace the entire circumference. Central flue rises through the core. Smoke surrenders heat to the stone as it passes. By the time exhaust exits most of the fire's energy, lives in the pillar itself. There were diagrams, careful drawings showing the circular foundation, the ring firebox, the layered stone construction, the central flue channel. Measurements in both inches and centimeters, calculations in notation that Stellan did not recognize but that Lana studied with widening eyes. He was going to build this, Lana said. This was what he wanted the granite for, the stone from the quarry. Stellan took the journal from her hands. He studied the diagrams, tracing his finger along lines his father had drawn years ago, perhaps decades ago, carrying the dream from Sweden to Montana and waiting for the right moment to make it real. The right moment that never came. A central pillar, Stellan said slowly. Stone in the middle of the room, fire wrapped around the base. That is what he wrote. That is what the Kakalugan builders knew for 500 years. Stellan looked at this corner stove. In winter, that stove could raise the temperature near the corner to 45 degrees while the far wall dropped to 8. They had slept in the warm corner, all 4 of them, crowded together while frost formed on walls 10 feet away. Every cabin in Montana was the same. Hot spots near the stove, cold spots at the far walls, families burning wood continuously through the night and still waking to cold that bit exposed skin. I am going to build it, Stellan said. Lana stared at him. Build what? The pillar. Father designed it. He gathered the stone. He made the calculations. He did everything except the building. Stellan, you are 17. You have never built anything like this. Father had 31 years of experience. I have his journal. Stellan held up the worn leather book. I have his measurements. I have his diagrams. And I watched him work since I was old enough to hold tools. I know more than you think. But the cabin, Lana began. Is failing, Stellan interrupted. The corner stove cannot heat it properly. We nearly froze last winter with both parents feeding the fire. How will we survive this winter alone? We cannot burn wood continuously around the clock. There is only one of me. When I sleep, the fire dies. When the fire dies, the cold comes, Unless the stone remembers, Lana finished quietly. Unless the stone remembers. Silence filled the cabin. Odin's tail thumped once against the wooden floor. Outside, the summer sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that neither of them paused to notice. Inside, two orphans held a journal that had contained their father's unfinished dream and began the impossible work of imagining how to finish it. Then Lana turned another page and stopped. Her face changed. The excitement that had been building in her eyes dimmed. She held the journal closer, running her finger along the edge of the paper, feeling what should not have been there. Pages were missing. Not one or two, several. Torn out roughly, the remaining edges ragged where they had been removed. Whether by accident or by damage from the flood or by some other cause, they would never know the pages were gone. Stellan saw her expression. What is it? Several pages are missing, Lana said, her voice suddenly small. Important ones. Calculations that father would have considered critical to the design. She looked up from the journal. Without those numbers, the system could fail completely. Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when hope newly arrived encounters its first obstacle. Odin whined softly, sensing the shift. Can you calculate it yourself? Stellan asked. Lana stared at the torn edges. She was 12 years old. She had never completed formal engineering training. She had never built anything more complex than a birdhouse. But she had grown up listening to her father explain thermal principles in the way that some fathers explain fishing or carpentry or hunting. She had absorbed his knowledge the way children absorb language, unconsciously, completely, before they have words to express what they understand. I can try, she said finally. The schoolhouse had books on natural philosophy. I remember some of the equations. If I understand the principle, perhaps I can derive the calculation myself. Stellan looked at her. You are 12 years old, he said. Not as a dismissal, as a statement of the impossible thing he was asking of her. I am 12 years old, Lana replied, and I am the only one who can read father's Swedish notation. I am 12 years old, and I am the only one who understood when he explained the physics of heat transfer. I am 12 years old, Stellan, but I am not helpless. He looked at his sister then, truly looked at her perhaps for the first time since their parents died. She stood straight despite the weight that had fallen on her young shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying she thought no one saw, but her jaw was set with a determination that matched his own, that perhaps exceeded his own, because determination in a 12-year-old who has lost everything carries a weight that determination in a 17-year-old does not. We do this together, he said. We do this together, she agreed. Odin's tail thumped once against the wooden floor. Outside, the summer sun was setting behind the mountains. Inside, two orphans began planning how to build something that everyone would say was impossible. They had 6 months before winter, a journal with missing pages, a quarry full of stone 8 miles away, a 12-year-old girl's mathematics, a 17-year-old boy's hands, and a gray elk hound who could not read blueprints but who would not leave their side. The entire town would call them foolish. The wealthiest man in the county wanted their land. Every practical voice in the territory would tell them that what they were attempting could not be done. But their father had been right about the principle. Iron forgets heat in minutes. Stone remembers heat for hours. The Americans would burn wood all night and wake shivering. Stellan and Lana would burn for 2 hours and wake warm, or they would freeze to death trying. Either way, the land was not for sale. Word traveled fast in small communities. In Gallatin County in 1887 was as small as communities came. 30 families scattered across a valley ringed by mountains that did not care whether those families lived or died. A general store that served as post office and gossip exchange. A saloon that served as courthouse and confessional. A church that served as schoolhouse and meeting hall. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone watched everyone. And by the end of June, everyone within 20 miles knew that the Allberg orphan was building something strange in the middle of where his cabin used to stand. The specifics varied depending on who told the story and how many times it had been repeated. Some said he was building a chimney without a fireplace. Some said he was constructing a well inside his house. Some said he had lost his mind from grief and was stacking rocks for no reason at all, the way a man sometimes does when the world takes everything and leaves him with nothing but his hands and a need to keep them moving. But the core of every version remained consistent: a stone pillar in the center of the room where the table should go, where the family should gather, where normal people put things that mattered. The Swedish boy was building a monument to his own foolishness. Harlan Whitmore heard the rumors from Marcus Treadwell, who owned the general store, and collected gossip the way some men collected coins. Every transaction came with a story. Every story came with an opinion. And every opinion, when it involved the Allberg orphans, carried the same conclusion. Failure was coming. It was only a matter of time. "The boy is hauling granite from that quarry east of his property," Treadwell said, leaning against his counter, "making trips twice a day every day. His sister helps him load the wagon, but she cannot lift the big stones. He has to do those himself." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "What is he building?" "Some kind of circular foundation. Right in the middle of where his cabin will stand. He tore down the old cabin his father built. Says he is starting fresh. Tore down a perfectly good cabin. Walls were drafty, apparently. Floor was rotting in one corner. The boy says he is building something better. Something his father designed." Whitmore set down the hammer he had been examining. "His father designed a lot of things. Designed a trip to the quarry that got him killed. Designed a homestead that cannot support 2 children. The boy inherits his father's talent for impractical dreams." Treadwell chuckled. "You want I should let you know when he fails? Might be you can make that offer again. $40 for land he cannot work. Make it 30. He will be more desperate by then." Stellan heard the talk. It was impossible not to. Every trip to town for supplies brought whispered conversations that stopped when he approached and resumed when he passed. Every interaction with neighbors carried an undertone of pity or mockery or both. Every face he encountered wore the same expression: that particular look people give to those they have already decided will fail. He said nothing. He kept his head down. He loaded his wagon with what he needed and returned to the homestead where Lana was waiting with the journal open and her own notes spread across the table and calculations that grew more complex each day. He had made his choice. The stone would speak for itself when winter came. Until then, let them say what they wanted. The work had begun in earnest the first week of June. Stellan tore down the old cabin. This was not a decision he made lightly. That cabin held 6 years of family memory. His mother had cooked in that cabin. His father had read by candlelight in that cabin. Lana had taken her first steps across that cabin's floor. But the walls were drafty, the floor was rotting in one corner, and the corner stove sat where corner stoves always sat, heating 1/4 of the room while the other 3/4 froze. He would start fresh, build something better, build something his father had designed. The foundation went in first. Stellan dug a circular pit 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep, working through soil that transitioned from loose topsoil to dense clay to gravel beneath. Each layer told a different story of the land. Each layer resisted his shovel differently. The topsoil gave way easily, almost willingly. The clay fought him. The gravel accepted his work with indifference. The digging took 2 weeks of labor that left his shoulders screaming and his hands raw. Blisters formed on top of blisters. His back seized on the 9th day, and he worked through the spasm because stopping was not something he could afford. Odin sat at the edge of the pit, watching him work, occasionally bringing sticks that Stellan did not have time to throw. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if the nature of that importance was beyond his comprehension. He filled the pit with compacted gravel and flat stones, tamping each layer with a wooden post until it was solid enough to hold his full weight without shifting. Over 3,000 pounds of granite would press down on this single point. Without proper footing, the pillar would settle unevenly. Uneven settling meant cracks. Cracks meant failure. Failure meant freezing. The foundation had to be perfect. It was during the foundation work that the first visitor came to observe. Dr. Phineas Osborne was 48 years old, the only physician within 50 miles, a man who had graduated from a medical college in Philadelphia and considered himself educated in the sciences. He had read Darwin and Kelvin and Faraday. He subscribed to journals. He used words like thermodynamics and specific heat in casual conversation, not because the conversation required them, but because he enjoyed the sound of his own expertise. He rode up on a Thursday afternoon dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had never fully made peace with horses and stood watching Stellan work for several minutes before speaking. Interesting project, Osborne said finally. His tone carried the particular brightness of someone who has already formed an opinion and is merely waiting for confirmation. Building some kind of cistern, Stellan straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with a forearm caked in clay. A foundation for a heating pillar. A heating pillar. Osborne repeated the words the way a teacher repeats an incorrect answer, giving the student a chance to hear how foolish it sounds. Stellan explained, stone mass, 3 feet in diameter floor to ceiling, ring firebox at the base. The stone absorbs heat during burning and releases it slowly for 12 hours or more after the fire dies. He spoke plainly without embellishment, the way his father had spoken when explaining principles to people who had not yet understood them. Osborne's eyebrows climbed his forehead with theatrical skepticism. Stone absorbs heat, he said. All materials absorb heat. Stone absorbs it slowly and releases it slowly. That is why stone buildings feel cool in summer. They are still releasing the cold they absorb during winter nights. And there it was, the opening Osborne had been waiting for. He leaned forward with the eager expression of a man about to deliver what he believed was a devastating counter-argument. But by that logic, he said your pillar would absorb the cold of winter and release it into your cabin. You would be making your home colder, not warmer. Stellan had anticipated this objection because Lana had anticipated it first. She had spent an evening preparing him for exactly this conversation, walking through the physics of thermal mass with the patience of a teacher and the precision of an engineer. The pillar absorbs whatever temperature surrounds it, Stellan said. In summer, yes, it absorbs ambient coolness. But in winter, we heat it intentionally. We build a fire around its base. We raise its temperature to over 200 degrees. Then when the fire dies, the stone releases that stored heat slowly over many hours. The mass is the key. 50 pounds of stone holds meaningful heat. 3,000 pounds holds enough to warm a cabin for half a day. Osborne was quiet for a moment, processing, recalculating. Then he shook his head with the finality of a man who has decided that his education outweighs another person's experience. I'm not a physicist, he admitted, which was the most honest thing he said that afternoon. But I have studied enough natural philosophy to know that heat transfer is complex. Your theory sounds plausible in principle, but practice often differs from theory. Stone may behave differently than you expect. The thermal mass may prove insufficient. The central placement may obstruct rather than enhance heat distribution. We will see, Stellan said. The confidence of youth. Osborne smiled the way adults smile at children who do not yet know what they do not know. He climbed back onto his horse with some difficulty, nodded once and rode away without looking back. Stellan returned to his work. The foundation was not going to tamp itself. The second visitor arrived 3 days later, and he was nothing like the first. Samuel Iron Horse was Crow, a hunter and tracker who lived on the edges of territory that his people had once owned entirely. He was 40 years old, weathered by seasons spent in the open, and he observed the world with eyes that missed nothing, because missing things in the Montana wilderness meant dying from them. He did not ride up on a horse. He simply appeared one afternoon standing at the edge of the construction site the way a tree stands at the edge of a clearing. As if he had always been there, and Stellan had simply failed to notice until now. Central Fire Iron Horse said. His English was accented but clear. My people build lodges the same way. Fire in the center. Smoke rises through the top. Heat reaches every part equally. The circle is sacred because it is efficient. No corners to trap cold. No far walls that cannot feel the fire. Stellan paused his work. You have seen this principle before. For generations before your people came. Iron Horse walked slowly around the ring firebox foundation, studying its construction with the careful attention of someone evaluating not just the work, but the thinking behind it. You add stone to remember the heat longer. Clever. My father's design. From Sweden. Iron Horse looked at him. Different land, same truth. He stayed for an hour. He asked questions about stone selection, mortar composition, the flue design, not the skeptical questions of a man looking for flaws, but the practical questions of a man who recognized sound engineering and wanted to understand its specifics. In return, he shared observations about Crow construction methods that Stellan had never encountered. Lodge placement relative to wind patterns, the use of hide layers for insulation, the geometry of circular structures and why circles distribute heat more efficiently than squares. The Americans built square houses with fire in corners, Iron Horse said as he prepared to leave. They fight the geometry instead of working with it. You understand what they do not. He offered a simple nod, the kind of nod that passes between men who have recognized something genuine in each other, something that does not require elaboration or ceremony. I will tell others, he said. Some will listen, some will not. But the truth spreads regardless. He walked away into the tree line and did not return until winter. When he did return, he would bring two elderly Crow women whose lives depended on the truth he had recognized that summer afternoon. The third visitor was less pleasant. Jed Sutter was 22 years old, a cowboy who worked for Harlan Whitmore, and who spent his free time drinking at the saloon and making bets on anything that could be wagered upon. Horse races, arm wrestling matches, the date of the first snow, the number of drinks a man could consume before falling off his stool. If it had an outcome, Sutter would bet on it. He rode up with two companions, young men of similar disposition, and all three sat their horses watching. Stellan lay the first course of the ring firebox with expressions of amused contempt. Three men on horseback looking down at a boy on his knees in the dirt. The geometry of mockery. So this is the famous pillar, Sutter called out. The monument to Swedish foolishness. Stellan did not respond. He continued laying fire brick in the circular pattern his father had designed, ensuring each piece fit precisely against its neighbors. The mortar had to be right. The gaps had to be uniform. One weak joint in the ring firebox could mean uneven heating, which could mean cracking, which could mean failure. He did not have attention to spare for men who had come to watch him fail. My boss says you turned down $40 for this land. Sutter continued, his voice carrying the performative volume of someone playing to an audience. $40. That is more money than most men see in a year. You could have taken it and started fresh somewhere sensible. Instead, you are building a pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere. One of his companions laughed. Maybe he plans to worship it. Saw that in a book once. Pagans building stone circles for their gods. It is not a religious monument. Lana had emerged from the temporary shelter where she had been working on calculations drawn outside by the sound of mockery directed at her brother. Odin stood beside her, hackles slightly raised, a low growl building in his throat. The dog understood tone better than words, and the tone of these men was not friendly. Sutter looked at her with the dismissive expression that certain young men reserve for young girls. The little sister speaks. Tell me, little girl, what is your brother building, if not a monument to foolishness? Lana did not flinch. She did not look away. She met his eyes with a steadiness that belonged to someone much older and much less impressed by men on horses. A heating system, she said. The stone absorbs heat from fire and releases it slowly over 12 to 14 hours. While your boss burns wood continuously and still wakes cold, we will burn for 2 hours and wake warm. The three cowboys exchanged glances. Then they burst out laughing. The sound carried across the construction site and beyond, reaching the trees where birds startled, and the creek where water continued its indifferent flow. 2 hours of fire and warmth all night, Sutter said, shaking his head. That is the best joke I have heard all week. Tell you what, Swedish boy. He leaned forward in his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. I will bet $5 your pillar collapses before Christmas. Who wants in? His companions each threw in $2. $9 total, wagered on failure. Wagered on the collapse of something they did not understand and had not bothered to try to understand. Stellan continued laying brick. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge the bet. Silent type, Sutter observed. Well, silence will not keep you warm when your pillar proves as useless as everyone knows it will be. They rode away laughing. The sound faded slowly, lingering in the air long after the riders had gone. Lana watched them disappear down the trail. Her fists were clenched at her sides. They do not understand, she said. They do not need to understand, Stellan replied, still not looking up from his work. They only need to see the results. Words mean nothing. The pillar will prove itself. Or it will not, Lana said quietly. Stellan finally met her eyes. Or it will not, he agreed, but I would rather fail trying than succeed at giving up. The fourth visitor came 3 days after the cowboys, and she was different from all the others. Cora Whitmore was 16 years old, the eldest daughter of Harlan Whitmore, and she possessed something her father lacked entirely. Curiosity unburdened by pride. She had heard the same rumors everyone had heard. She had listened to her father dismiss the Allberg orphans over dinner. She had absorbed the consensus of the community that the Swedish boy was building something useless, impossibly insane. And she had wondered, what if they were wrong? She rode up alone on a gray mare dismounted with the practiced grace of someone raised around horses and walked directly to where Stellan was laying the ring firebox. Odin raised his head, assessed her, and settled back down. Dogs knew things about people that people did not always know about themselves. Whatever Odin sensed in Cora Whitmore, it was not a threat. "I heard about your pillar," she said. Her voice carried none of her father's condescension. It carried something else, genuine interest, the rarest commodity in a community built on certainty. "I want to understand how it works. Your father thinks it is foolishness. My father thinks many things. That does not make him right." She knelt beside the circular construction, studying the fire brick pattern. She asked questions, not the loaded questions of someone looking for reasons to dismiss, but the open questions of someone looking for reasons to believe. How does stone hold heat longer than iron? Why circular instead of square? What determines how long the heat lasts? Stellan said. "Weight. A heavy stone holds more heat than a light one. Many pounds hold more than few." "But iron stoves are heavy," Cora pressed. "They cool in an hour. Iron has different properties. It absorbs heat quickly and releases it quickly. Stone absorbs slowly and releases slowly. The same principle that makes stone buildings cool in summer makes them warm in winter if you heat them intentionally." "Will you show me the calculations? I have studied some mathematics. I would like to understand the numbers behind the principle." Lana emerged from the shelter with the journal in her hands. She had been listening as she always listened, evaluating whether this visitor was friend or threat. Something in Cora's questions had passed the test. "I can show you," Lana said, "if you truly want to learn." Cora smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm and curious, carrying none of her father's practiced expressions of superiority. "I truly want to learn," she said. She stayed for 3 hours that first day. She returned twice weekly throughout the summer and fall. She learned calculations from Lana and construction principles from Stellan and became something neither of them had expected. A friend, the daughter of the man who wanted to take their land, sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor, studying Swedish thermal engineering from a 12-year-old girl, and finding it more fascinating than anything she'd encountered in her 16 years. Old Tobias Engstrom came during the firebox construction. He was 71 years old, too old for heavy lifting, but not too old for wisdom. He stood at the edge of the site watching Stellan work, and when Stellan finally noticed him, the old man was smiling. "Kekalugan," Angstrom said in Swedish, "your father's dream. You knew about this. Every Swede from Dalarna knows about central thermal mass. Your father spoke of it often, how he would build one when he had time, when he had resources, when the farm was established. He never had time." "No," Angstrom stepped closer. He examined the ring firebox with the professional eye of a craftsman who recognized good work when he saw it. His fingers traced the mortar joints. His eyes measured the spacing of the air intake gaps. He nodded slowly the way a teacher nods when a student has exceeded expectations. "But you have time," he said, "and you have his journal, and you have better instincts than you know. The Americans think I am building my own grave. The Americans burn wood continuously and still wait cold. They do not understand what we understand." Angstrom straightened. His old eyes met Stellan's young ones across a distance measured not in feet but in generations. "I remember the Kakalugan in my grandmother's house in Mora," he said quietly. "December. She would build one fire at 6 in the evening. The next morning the tiles were still warm, every part of the room the same temperature. No hot spots, no cold spots, just warmth everywhere. You could press your palm against the tiles at midnight and feel the day's fire still living inside them. That is what I am trying to build." "I know," Engstrom clasped Stellan's shoulder with a grip that belied his age. "Your father would be proud. I will help where I can. I am too old for heavy lifting, but I can advise. I can fill the gaps that the journal cannot fill. I can tell the Americans you are not crazy. They will not listen. Some will." Engstrom smiled. "The old ones, the ones who remember the old ways, the ones who have lived long enough to know that new is not always better and different is not always wrong." He stayed for dinner that night, sharing a simple meal of bread and stew with Stellan and Lana, telling stories of their parents that made them laugh and cry in equal measure. Stories of Niels as a young man in Dalarna, already obsessed with heat, in stone, and already arguing with anyone who would listen that the old Kakalugnar were superior to any modern heating invention. Stories of Astrid, who had the patience to love a man whose mind was always half inside a wall of brick, calculating temperatures and ratios while the world went on around him. When Angstrom left, he promised to return. He kept that promise, visiting twice weekly throughout the construction, offering guidance that filled gaps in the journal, and decades of practical experience that compensated for Stellan's youth. The Americans might mock, but the Swedes understood. The ring firebox took shape over the following weeks. 8 inches wide, 12 inches tall, a channel that wrapped completely around what would become the pillar's base. 4 gaps spaced evenly around the perimeter for air intake. A slight inward slope to the floor for ash collection. Stellan worked from memory and from diagrams and from instinct he did not know he possessed. His hands learned what his mind had only observed. The feel of mortar at the right consistency. The sound brick made when properly seated. The rhythm of construction that his father had embodied and that somehow lived in Stellan, too passed down not through instruction, but through the accumulated hours of a boy watching his father work. Lana helped where she could, mixing mortar cleaning tools, reading measurements aloud from the journal. But her primary work was elsewhere. Her primary work was mathematics. The missing pages haunted her. The flue ratio was the critical calculation, the one that determined whether smoke would exit cleanly or fill the cabin with deadly fumes. Too narrow and the channel would restrict airflow, causing back pressure that would push smoke into the room. Too wide, and the draft would weaken the air, moving too slowly to create the suction needed to pull smoke upward. There was an optimal size. She knew it existed because her father had calculated it and written it on the pages that were now gone. She spent 3 weeks on the problem. 3 weeks of studying physics texts borrowed from the schoolhouse. 3 weeks of working equations by candlelight while her brother slept. 3 weeks of filling page after page with calculations that she checked and rechecked and checked again because an error would not mean a failed grade. An error would mean death. The central flue, she said one evening, spreading papers across the table that sat outside because there was no longer a cabin to contain it. The torn pages covered the ratio of flue diameter to firebox volume. Without that ratio, we cannot ensure proper draft. Stellan wiped stone dust from his hands. What do your calculations show? Lana hesitated. She had been studying the physics of convection. Hot air rises because it is less dense than cold air. The speed of the rise depends on the temperature differential and the height of the column and the diameter of the channel. These were not simple relationships. They involved square roots and ratios and principles that university students struggled with. She was 12 years old. The hotter the fire and the taller the flue and the narrower the channel, the faster the smoke rises, she explained. But if the channel is too narrow, it restricts flow. If it is too wide, the draft becomes weak because the air moves too slowly. So there is an optimal size. There is. Lana pointed to a series of equations she had written in careful script, based on the firebox dimensions father specified, and the height of the pillar he designed. I believe the flue should be approximately 8 inches in diameter. That provides sufficient draft for proper exhaust while allowing the smoke to transfer maximum heat to the surrounding stone. You believe? I cannot be certain. Father's training included practical experience I do not have, but the mathematics support this conclusion. And it feels right. The proportions match what I remember from Father's descriptions of Kakalugnar in the old country. Stellan studied his sister's calculations. He understood perhaps half of what she had written. The rest was beyond his education. But he trusted Lana, trusted her intelligence and her dedication and her connection to their father's knowledge. 8 inches, he said. We build the flue at 8 inches. Lana nodded, and we pray that I am not wrong. August came with heat that seemed impossible after the brutal winter before. Stellan worked stripped to the waist, sweat pouring down his back muscles, hardened into something that no longer resembled a 17-year-old boy's body. The pillar grew slowly, 3 inches per day. Each course laid in a circular pattern, joints staggered like brickwork, mortar mixed with clay and lime for heat resistance. The central flue channel rose through the core, 8 inches in diameter, exactly as Lana had calculated, lined with clay slip to prevent smoke from penetrating the mortar joints. By mid-August, the pillar stood 4 feet tall, halfway to completion, a monument of gray granite rising from the ring firebox like something ancient and permanent, something that belonged to the landscape rather than merely sitting upon it. That was when the hailstorm came. It struck without warning, as mountain storms do. One moment the sky was clear, the particular blue that August brings to Montana, deep and endless and deceptive in its calm. The next moment, clouds black as coal rolled over the peaks with terrifying speed. Lightning split the air. Thunder shook the ground with a violence that sent Odin racing for cover. And then the hail began. Not small hail, not the gentle patter that sometimes accompanied spring rains. These were chunks of ice the size of walnuts falling so thick they turned the air white, striking everything with the force of thrown stones. The sound was overwhelming, a roar that drowned thought and replaced it with pure instinct. Stellan grabbed Lana and ran for the temporary shelter they had been living in while the new cabin took shape. Odin raced beside them, yelping as hailstones struck his back. They huddled together while the storm raged, listening to ice pound against the wooden walls, feeling the structure shudder with each impact, praying it would hold. 20 minutes. The storm lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. 20 minutes that changed everything. When they emerged, the pillar was damaged. A third of the upper courses had collapsed. Hailstones had struck the fresh mortar before it fully cured cracking joints, dislodging stones, sending carefully placed granite tumbling to the ground in a cascade of destruction that the storm delivered with casual indifference. 2 weeks of work, 14 days of lifting stone that weighed more than a boy should lift, of mixing mortar, until his arms could not mix anymore, of laying each course with the precision his father would have demanded. Gone, scattered across the ground like broken promises. Stellan stood in the wreckage. Ice was still melting around his feet, turning the dirt to mud. The pillar rose 4 feet on one side and barely 2 on the other, its top ragged and broken where the courses had fallen. It looked wounded. It looked like something that had been attacked by a world that did not want it to exist. Lana came up beside him. Her hand found his. "We can rebuild," she said quietly. "Yes," Stellan agreed, "we can rebuild." But he did not move. He stood looking at the ruined top of his pillar, at the scattered stones, at the dreams that suddenly seemed further away than they had the day before. Odin pressed against his leg, whimpering softly, sensing the thing that Stellan would not say. The doubt, the exhaustion, the voice in the back of his mind that sounded like Harlan Whitmore saying the boy will learn. He knelt and wrapped his arms around the dog. He buried his face in gray fur that smelled of rain and earth and loyalty. And for the first time since his parents died, he allowed himself to cry. Not the quiet tears that sometimes came at night when he thought Lana was asleep. Real crying. The kind that shakes the body and empties the chest and does not stop when you want it to because it has been waiting too long. Lana stood beside him. She did not speak. She placed her hand on his back and let him grieve. Not just for the pillar, for everything. For the parents buried in hard Montana soil. For the childhood that had ended the day the creek swallowed a wagon. For the weight of being 17 and responsible for everything and certain of nothing. He cried until there was nothing left. Then he wiped his face on Odin's fur, which the dog accepted with the patience of an animal who understood that some things mattered more than dignity. He stood, he took a breath, and he began sorting the fallen stones. The news of the hailstorm damage reached town within hours. By evening, everyone knew. By the next morning, Harlan Whitmore was saddling his horse. He arrived just after noon, found Stellan already at work, clearing debris, separating stones that could be reused from stones that had cracked beyond salvage. The boy's eyes were red, but his movements were steady, methodical, determined. The hands that had been still with grief 12 hours ago were busy again with purpose. Whitmore dismounted. He walked to where Stellan worked with the measured pace of a man who knows the value of timing. "I heard about the storm. Terrible luck." Stellan did not look up. "Storms happen." "They do," Whitmore agreed. "They happen to everyone. But they hit hardest those who are already struggling. An established rancher loses some roof shingles. A boy trying to build something impossible loses weeks of work. The pillar can be rebuilt." "Can it?" Whitmore gestured at the scattered stones, the broken mortar, the half-destroyed construction. "You have been working since June. It is now August. Winter comes in 4 months. Even if you rebuild, will you finish in time? Will your cabin be ready? Will your heating system be functional before the first killing frost?" Stellan finally looked up. "It will be ready." Whitmore sighed. The sound was practiced. $30, he said. "Still a fair price. More than fair given the circumstances. Take it. Walk away before this foolishness kills you. My land is not for sale." Pride, Whitmore said, his voice losing its patience, is a luxury you cannot afford. Pride has nothing to do with it. Stellan straightened, holding a chunk of granite in his hands. "My father designed this pillar. He spent 31 years learning the principles. He brought that knowledge across an ocean and held it safe through 6 Montana winters, waiting for the right time to build. He died before he could. I will not let his knowledge die with him. Knowledge. Whitmore spat the word. Your father's knowledge got him killed hauling stone in a flood. His knowledge left you orphaned on land you cannot work. His knowledge has you building a pillar that every sensible person in this county knows is a waste of time and resources. Lana emerged from the shelter. The journal was pressed against her chest, held there with both arms the way a person holds something irreplaceable. Odin stood beside her, growling softly at the man whose voice had risen loud enough to be a threat. Every sensible person, Stellan said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of something that would not bend, will see the truth when winter comes. Whitmore stared at him. The frustration in his face was genuine. This was not a man enjoying the torment of children. This was a man who believed he was right, believed the world worked according to rules he understood, believed that a 17-year-old orphan building a stone pillar was an act of self-destruction that he had a moral duty to prevent, or at least a financial opportunity to exploit. Boy is building his own grave before he is even dead, Whitmore said, turning toward his horse. Remember, I tried to help. Remember, I offered fair payment. When you come crawling back, the price will be lower. He mounted. He rode away. He did not look back. Stellan watched until horse and rider disappeared behind the tree line. Then he turned to his sister. We rebuild, Lana said. Faster this time. We know what we are doing now. The stones can be resorted and relayed in half the original time. Stellan took the journal from her hands, felt its weight, felt the connection to their father that no storm could break and no rancher could buy. We prove everyone wrong, he said. They worked until darkness made work impossible. Then they ate a cold dinner in silence and slept without speaking and rose before dawn to work again. September came with hints of autumn that made Stellan's hands move faster. The pillar grew again, rising from its base with each passing day. The damaged sections were repaired. The upper courses were relaid with mortar that had more time to cure in the cooler weather. The central flue channel ascended through the core, 8 inches in diameter, exactly as Lana had calculated. By the end of September, the pillar stood complete, 3 feet in diameter, 8 feet tall, over 3,000 pounds of dense granite, with a ring firebox embracing its base and a central flue rising to the roof. The cabin walls had gone up around it, log construction with careful chinking, leaving the pillar standing in the exact center of the single room, like something that had always been there, like something the cabin had been built to contain rather than the other way around. Old Tobias Angstrom came on the day of completion. He walked around the pillar, slowly running his weathered hands over the smooth granite, examining mortar joints with fingers that had evaluated 1,000 such joints in a lifetime of building. He peered into the ring firebox and up the central flue and pressed his palm flat against the stone and held it there. Your father would weep with pride, he said finally. His voice was not steady. This is better than many Kekalugnar I saw in Sweden. The proportions are perfect. The construction is sound. He turned to Lana. The flue channel. I calculated it with father's principles and my own mathematics. 12 years old and already an engineer, he said. He turned to Stellan. When do you test it? Tonight. They built the first fire at 6 in the evening. Stellan arranged kindling and small logs in the ring firebox, spacing them evenly around the circumference so that flames would embrace the entire base of the pillar simultaneously. He struck a match. The kindling caught. The fire spread. Within minutes, flames were dancing around the pillar's base, licking at granite that had never known heat-warming stone that had spent eons in the cold earth, waiting for exactly this purpose. Smoke rose into the central flue, spiraling up through the pillar's core. Stellan watched it with the intensity of a man watching his future take shape. If the smoke backed up, if the draft failed, if Lana's calculation was wrong, the cabin would fill with fumes and the entire project would be proven a failure. The smoke rose cleanly. The draft pulled. Lana's 8 inches held. They fed the fire for 2 hours. 2 hours of carefully managed burning, adding logs as needed, ensuring that flames remained consistent around the entire circumference. The cabin grew warm, then hot, then almost uncomfortable. Angstrom produced a small thermometer from his coat pocket and hung it on the far wall. The wall that should have been cold, the wall that in every other cabin in Montana would have been coated with frost by morning. At 8 o'clock, Stellan banked the coals and stopped feeding the fire. Now we wait, he said. They waited. They checked temperatures every hour. They watched the fire die in the ring firebox until only embers remained, then only ash, then nothing. No flame, no glow, just stone. Angstrom fell asleep in a chair sometime after 11. Lana curled up on a blanket near the pillar and drifted off with Odin stretched beside her. Stellan fought sleep as long as he could, dozing in his father's old chair, waking periodically to press his palm against the granite. Midnight, 6 hours after the fire died, he pressed his hand to the stone. 160 degrees, too hot to hold against for long. He pulled his hand back and stared at it. The heat was real. The stone was remembering. 3 in the morning, 9 hours. He touched the stone again. 130 degrees, still hot, still radiating. Dawn, 12 hours after the last log was added to the fire. 12 hours since any flame had touched the stone. Stellan pressed both palms flat against the granite and held them there. 95 degrees, warm, after 12 hours, after an entire night, warm. He walked to each corner of the cabin. He checked the thermometers Angstrom had hung on each wall. North wall 58 degrees, south wall 59 degrees, east corner 58 degrees, west corner 57 degrees. A variation of 2 degrees. Across the entire cabin, from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, 2 degrees. No hot spots near the pillar. No cold spots at the far walls. Just warmth. Everywhere. 12 hours after the fire died, Angstrom was awake now, standing, his old eyes glistening with something that 71 years of living had not managed to extinguish. Your father's dream, he said softly, made real. Lana sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, Odin yawning beside her. She looked at Stellan. She did not need to ask. His face told her everything. It worked, she said. Stellan could not speak. He walked to the pillar and pressed both palms against the granite, feeling heat that had persisted through the night. Heat that his father had designed, that his sister had calculated, that he had built with hands that had bled and blistered and calloused over 4 months of labor that the entire community had called foolish. It worked, he said. Odin's tail thumped against the floor. Outside, the October sun was rising over mountains that would soon be capped with winter snow. Inside, 2 orphans stood beside a pillar that would keep them alive through whatever that winter brought. But this was October, a mild October night barely touching freezing. Montana winters did not barely touch anything. They struck with killing force. And on Christmas Eve, old Tobias Angstrom stood outside the cabin and stared at the western horizon with an expression that Stellan had never seen on the old man's face. An expression that looked like fear. The sky has the wrong color, Angstrom said. That gray, that particular gray, I have seen it before. What does it mean? Pressure is dropping, has been dropping for 3 days. The birds are flying south early. The animals are restless. He turned to face Stellan and Lana, his old face grave with knowledge he wished he did not possess. I have lived in Montana 35 years. I have learned to read this land the way I once read timber grain. A storm is coming. Not an ordinary storm, the kind they tell stories about for decades afterward. The kind that kills. When? Days, perhaps a week at most. He gripped Stellan's shoulder. Your pillar will be tested. Tested in ways that will leave no doubt. Either it will prove everything your father believed or we will freeze, Stellan said. Angstrom held his gaze. I do not believe you will freeze. I have touched your pillar. I have felt its warmth. I have watched you build it with skill your father would have envied. But belief is not certainty. Only the storm will provide certainty. Then let the storm come, Stellan said. November had already proven the pillar's daily performance. Temperatures dropped from the 40s to the 20s to the teens, and Stellan maintained his routine. 2 hours of fire each evening. The pillar charged. The cabin held 55 to 60 degrees through every night. While neighbors added blankets and burned through cordwood and still woke, shivering, Stellan and Lana slept comfortably and woke to warmth. They used 1/10 the firewood their neighbors consumed, 1/10 the fuel for better results. But still, the skeptics held firm. They are lying, Jed Sutter declared at the saloon. Nobody heats a cabin with a pile of rocks. They are probably burning wood all night and just saying otherwise. Dr. Osborne agreed. The boys' claims violate basic thermodynamics. Marcus Treadwell suggested that old Angstrom was sneaking in to feed the fire while the children slept. Harlan Whitmore listened and said nothing. He did not need to. The consensus was clear. Wait for the real cold, they said. Wait for January. Wait for the kind of weather that kills livestock and freezes streams solid. Then we will see what the pillar can do. December deepened. 20 below zero became normal. The temperature differential in corner stove cabins became deadly serious. And Stellan prepared. He stacked cordwood inside the cabin enough for 3 weeks of continuous heating if the pillars somehow failed. He reinforced the chinking between every log. He tested the pillar repeatedly, documenting performance that Lana entered into a new journal that would continue their father's work. The storm was coming. Angstrom had read it in the sky. The pillar had been tested in mild conditions and passed. Now it would face the real examination. And Stellan stood ready, or as ready as a 17-year-old boy with a stone pillar in a prayer could be. Angstrom returned to his own cabin after Christmas, promising to come back at the first sign of serious weather. He was a man of his word. Part 3, The Stone Remembers. The storm came on January 7th, 1888. It did not announce itself with drama. It arrived the way death sometimes arrives, quietly, at first and almost politely, as if asking permission before taking everything. Snow began falling through the morning, steady but unremarkable. Wind picked up by noon, pushing the flakes sideways, piling them against fence posts and cabin walls and the trunks of trees that had weathered 1,000 such days. Visibility dropped through the afternoon, the mountains disappearing first, then the tree line, then the barn, then the fence that stood 40 feet from the cabin door. By evening, the world had shrunk to the size of whatever you could see through the nearest window, which was almost nothing. Nothing unusual for Montana in January. Nothing to suggest catastrophe. But the barometer told a different story. Stellan had purchased one in town during November, a small brass instrument that Lana had calibrated using Angstrom's guidance. She checked it every morning with the same attention that some people give a clock, not because she needed the specific number, but because the trend told her things the sky could not. The trend had been falling for 3 days. On the morning of January 7th, it dropped off a cliff. The wind shifted at sunset. It had been blowing from the northwest, which was normal, which was manageable. At 6:14 in the evening, it swung to due north. Lana noticed because Lana noticed everything. She stood at the window watching the snow change direction, watching the flakes that had been falling at an angle suddenly come straight down, then angle the other way, driven by air that was no longer coming from the mountains to the west, but from somewhere much farther north, somewhere much colder. She turned from the window. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something that Stellan had learned to read over the months they had spent relying on each other for survival. "Build the fire now," she said. "A full charge. Everything the firebox can hold." It was early. They normally lit the evening fire at 6:30. It was barely 6:15. Stellan did not ask why. He had learned to trust his sister's instincts the way he trusted the journal's calculations. He loaded the ring firebox with seasoned oak and pine, packing it tighter than usual, filling every inch of the channel that wrapped around the pillar's base. He lit it from 4 points simultaneously, the way experience had taught him, produced the most uniform heating. Flames rose around the stone, embracing the granite from every direction, beginning the process of charging 3,000 pounds of thermal mass with the heat that would need to last through whatever was coming. Outside, the temperature began its freefall. 18 degrees at noon, 6 degrees at sunset, 12 below zero at midnight, and still falling with a speed that the brass barometer could measure, but that the human body could only feel as a tightening, a constricting, as if the air itself was being squeezed by something enormous and merciless and very far from finished. By the morning of January 8th, the mercury in the thermometer outside the assay office in town had frozen solid at 43 degrees below zero. 43 below, that is not a number that means much on paper. It is just digits, a minus sign and 2 figures. But 43 below zero is a temperature at which exposed flesh freezes in under 5 minutes, at which metal burns skin on contact, at which the moisture in your nostrils crystallizes with each inhalation, sealing your nose shut, forcing you to breathe through your mouth where the air hits your lungs like swallowing broken glass, at which the trees crack with sounds like rifle shots, because the sap inside them is freezing and expanding and splitting the wood from within, at which horses die standing up and cattle freeze where they stand, and dogs that are left outside simply do not exist by morning. Winds screamed down from the peaks at 25 miles per hour, driving the effective temperature to something beyond what any instrument could measure and beyond what any living body could survive. This was the Arctic outbreak of 1888, a polar vortex collapse that sent air from the Siberian steppe cascading across the Canadian plains and down into Montana with the focused malice of something that wanted the world dead. Old-timers would reference it for decades afterward, asking each other if any given winter was as bad as 88. The answer was almost always no. For 5 days, the temperature never rose above 30 below zero. For 5 nights, it plunged past 40, touching 48 on the worst night. Wind blew constantly, finding every crack in every wall, every gap in every chink, every failure of construction and material that the builders had hoped would not matter. Every corner stove in every cabin in Gallatin County became a monument to inadequacy. Now we must leave the Allberg cabin for a while. We must visit other homes. We must see what was happening in the cabins that did not have a pillar. Because without understanding what the cold did to those who faced it with nothing but iron stoves and corner fires, you cannot understand what the pillar truly meant. 2 miles south of the Allberg homestead, the Henderson family huddled around their corner stove while it blazed at maximum capacity. The father fed it continuously, logs every 30 minutes. The iron glowed red in the dark room, throwing heat outward in the one direction that physics allowed, toward the corner, into the walls that flanked it, across perhaps 8 feet of floor space. Beyond that, the heat surrendered. Beyond that, the cold won. Their 8-year-old son slept in the far corner. It was the corner farthest from the stove, but it was also the corner nearest the window that the boy liked because in summer he could watch the stars from his bed. His parents had piled every warm blanket they owned on top of him. 3 quilts in a wool throw and a buffalo robe that his grandfather had traded for decades ago. The blankets formed a mountain over his small body. They should have been enough. In any normal winter, they would have been enough. This was not a normal winter. The corner near the stove measured 45 degrees. The corner where the boy slept measured 6. A differential of 39 degrees within a single room. 39 degrees between survival and death, separated by 20 feet of floor that the corner stove could not bridge. The boy fell asleep listening to the wind. He did not wake up. Hypothermia took him the way it takes children, gently, gradually lowering his body temperature degree by degree, while the blankets that should have saved him could not generate heat and could only slow the loss of heat that was already insufficient. He did not struggle. He did not cry out. He simply slipped from sleep into something deeper, and by the time his mother checked on him at dawn, he had been gone for hours. He died 6 feet from warmth that could not reach him. 6 feet, the length of a man lying down. The distance between the edge of a stove's effective range and the corner where a child slept, because the geometry of corner heating does not care about children. It does not care about anything. It is just physics. And physics does not negotiate. At the Whitmore Ranch, the situation was different in scale, but identical in principle. Harlan Whitmore had 2 iron stoves, not one. He had more wood, more blankets, more resources than any family in the county. His wife, his eldest son, and his daughter Cora ran the stoves in shifts, stumbling from bed every 2 hours to keep the fires alive, because letting them die meant letting the cold advance, and the cold in this storm did not retreat once it gained ground. Cora fed the stove at midnight and again at 2 in the morning and thought about the pillar. She had spent months learning its principles from Lana, understanding the mathematics of thermal mass, seeing with her own eyes the diagrams in the journal and the calculations in Lana's careful hand. She had begged her father to build one. He had refused. He had called it Swedish foolishness. He had said that 2 good iron stoves could outperform any pile of rocks. Now she crouched before the stove at 2 in the morning, feeding it logs, watching her little sister Della across the room, and knowing that 2 miles away, 2 orphans were sleeping peacefully beside a pillar of granite that held the warmth her father's money could not buy. Della Whitmore was 6 years old. She had her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn temperament and a laugh that could fill a room in summer, but that had not been heard in 3 days. She developed a cough on the 2nd night of the storm. By the 3rd night, her lips had turned blue. Her skin had gone the color of tallow. She stopped complaining about the cold because complaining required energy that her body was diverting to the simple task of keeping her organs functioning. The corner near the main stove held 48 degrees when roaring at full strength. The far corner held 11. The family slept in the hot corner, piled together, sharing body heat that was inadequate for the task of surviving temperatures that the cabin was never designed to withstand. Whitmore watched his daughter weaken and felt something crack inside him. Not a bone, something deeper. The certainty that had carried him through 30 years of Montana ranching. The confidence that had allowed him to look at a 17-year-old orphan building a stone pillar and call him a fool. The pride that had made him offer $30 for land that 2 children valued at any price. He was the wealthiest man in Gallatin County. He could buy anything within 100 miles. He could hire anyone. He could build anything. And his daughter was dying 12 feet from a stove that could not reach her, and all his wealth was as useful as ashes in a dead fire. By the evening of January 10th, the coldest night of the outbreak, Della had stopped responding to her name. She lay limp in her mother's arms, breathing in shallow gasps that seemed to grow weaker each time Whitmore counted them. Her lips were not just blue now, they were gray. Her hands were cold, even pressed against her mother's chest. She was 6 years old, and she was leaving slowly, quietly, the way the heat left a cabin through walls that could not hold it. The doctor could not be summoned. The roads were impassable. The cold was unsurvivable for any journey longer than a few hundred yards. They were alone with their dying child and their roaring stoves and the terrible mathematics of corner heating that no amount of money could change. And Whitmore remembered. He remembered the pillar. He remembered the stone rising from floor to ceiling in the center of a cabin 2 miles east. He remembered the boy's quiet voice explaining thermal mass. He remembered the girl's fierce eyes defending calculations that grown men had dismissed. He remembered laughing at those claims. He remembered calling the boy a fool. He remembered predicting that winter would teach lessons that pride could not survive. Now winter was teaching him. "I have to go," he told his wife. She sat rocking Nadella, her face hollow with exhaustion and fear, her eyes empty of everything except the desperate determination to hold her daughter as long as holding made any difference. Go where? The Swedish boy, his pillar, his heating system. If what he claimed is true, if it works the way he said it works, it is the only warm place within reach. His wife looked at him. Her eyes held something beyond exhaustion, something that might have been contempt or might have been admiration for a man willing to swallow his pride when his child's life depended on it. "You mocked him," she said. "You called him a fool. You offered to buy his land because you were certain he would fail. And now you want to beg him for help. I want our daughter to live." The words hung in the air between them. Simple words. The simplest words a father can speak. Stripped of pride and calculation and business acumen and every other thing that Harlan Whitmore had built his identity upon. Just a father holding the only truth that mattered. His wife looked at the child in her arms, the gray lips, the shallow breathing, the small body that was losing a fight it did not know it was fighting. "Go," she whispered. "Go now, before it is too late." Whitmore wrapped himself in everything he owned. 3 pairs of gloves, 2 scarves wound around his face until only his eyes were exposed, a hat pulled so low it pressed against his eyebrows. He lifted Della from his wife's arms, wrapping the child in blankets until she was a bundle with a small face barely visible at one end. He told his son to keep the stoves burning. He told Cora to watch over her mother. He did not say what they all knew, that he might not make it, that 2 miles in this cold with a dying child was not a journey, but a wager with death. He opened the door and stepped into the killing night. The wind hit him like something physical, like being struck by a wall that moved. His lungs seized at the first breath of 48 below air, the cold reaching down his throat and squeezing his chest with fingers made of ice. His eyes watered instantly, and the tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. His nostrils sealed shut with the first inhalation, the moisture inside them crystallizing into barriers that forced him to gasp through his mouth, where the air entered like a blade. 2 miles. 2 miles through this, with a child who might already be dead in his arms. He walked, one step, then another, then another. The snow was thigh-deep in places where the wind had not scoured it away, and ankle-deep where it had. The wind pushed him sideways, staggering him, threatening to topple him with every gust. He could not see the trail. He could not see anything except white. White snow and white wind and white air that seemed to have swallowed the entire world and replaced it with nothing. He walked because stopping meant dying, and dying meant his daughter died with him. He walked because somewhere ahead, 2 miles or 100 miles or 1,000 miles through this white void, there was a cabin with a stone pillar in its center that a 17-year-old boy had built while an entire community laughed. He walked because pride was a luxury that weighed too much to carry through 48 below zero, and his daughter's life was worth more than his dignity and always had been, even when he had been too blind to know it. He could not feel his feet after the first half mile. He could not feel his hands after the first mile. He could feel only the weight of the child in his arms and the cold that was trying to take them both, and the thin, stubborn thread of will that kept his legs moving when his body had every reason to stop. The cabin appeared as a darker shape in the whiteness, a shadow with straight lines that nature did not produce. And rising from its roof, thin but steady against the howling wind, a column of smoke. Not the thick black smoke of a fire burning desperately, just a thin gray line. The signature of a system that did not need to burn desperately because the stone was doing what the stone had been built to do. He reached the door. He knocked. The sound was weak, barely audible above the wind. His hands were beyond feeling. His arms were failing from the weight of the child he had carried for 2 miles through cold that should have killed them both. He knocked again, weaker. The door opened. Stellan stood in the doorway. Behind him, the cabin glowed with warmth that was visible in the way the air moved, the way the light fell, the way the space simply felt different from the frozen void outside. Lana was asleep on her bed in the corner, wrapped in blankets she did not truly need. Odin lay near the pillar, his gray fur warm, his breathing steady. The pillar rose in the center of the room, 3 feet of granite from floor to ceiling, and even from the doorway, Whitmore could sense what it was doing, radiating in every direction, filling the cabin with heat that came not from flame but from stone that remembered flame. "Please," Whitmore whispered. His voice was barely human, stripped of everything. "My daughter, she is dying. My cabin cannot keep her warm." Stellan did not hesitate. He did not pause to consider the history between them. He did not allow even a fraction of a second for the memory of mockery, the insults, the lowball offers, the predictions of failure. He looked at a man holding a dying child, and he saw only what mattered. "Bring her inside," he said. He stepped back from the doorway. Whitmore stumbled through. Stellan slammed the door against the killing cold, and Harlan Whitmore stopped. He stood in the center of the cabin, his daughter in his arms, his body still shaking with violent tremors. But the shaking was slowing. His breathing was steadying. Something was wrapping around him that he had not felt in days. Not the sharp heat of a roaring stove. Not the localized burn of standing too close to flame. This was different. This was everywhere. It came from the left and from the right and from ahead and from behind. It came from the floor and from the walls and from the air itself. It surrounded him like stepping into a warm bath. Complete, uniform, inescapable. He looked at the pillar. The ring firebox at its base held only ash. No flames, no coals. Nothing burning. But the stone was warm. 15 hours after the last fire had been lit on the coldest night in 40 years of Montana history, the stone was warm. He walked to the nearest corner. The corner farthest from the pillar. The corner that in any other cabin would have been a death sentence for anyone small enough or weak enough to be placed there. He pressed his free hand against the wall. Warm. He walked to the opposite corner, pressed his hand against that wall. Warm. Every wall, every corner, every inch of this cabin was warm. The stone in the center was keeping its promise. The stone was remembering. Lana was already awake, already moving with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment, because preparation was what she did. She spread blankets on the floor near the pillar in the zone where the heat was strongest, but not hot enough to burn. She had water warming on a small grate positioned near the stone's base. "Lay her here," Lana said, not touching the stone. "It is still quite hot at the surface, but near it, where the radiation is strongest." Whitmore obeyed. He knelt and placed Della on the blankets, unwrapping the frozen outer layers, revealing the small face beneath. Della Whitmore, 6 years old, lips gray, skin the color of candle wax, breathing so shallow that each breath seemed like it might be the last. "She is hypothermic," Lana said. "We need to warm her slowly. Sudden heat could shock her system. The pillar radiates gently, which is exactly what she needs. Gradual uniform warmth from every direction." "How do you know this?" Whitmore asked. His voice was a ruin. "I have studied everything I could find about cold and heat in the human body. My father was an engineer. I am learning to be one too. And I prepare for emergencies because emergencies do not wait for people who are unprepared." Whitmore looked at this 12-year-old girl who spoke with the authority of a physician and the composure of a woman 3 times her age. And then he looked at the parent standing by the door, the one whose pillar was the only thing standing between life and death on this night. The boy he had called a fool. "I called you a fool," he said. Stellan said nothing. "I said you were building your own grave. I offered to buy your land for $30 because I was certain you would fail." Stellan said nothing. "I was wrong." Whitmore's voice broke. Not cracked. Broke. The way a dam breaks when the water behind it has built to a pressure that the structure cannot contain. About all of it, I was wrong. Stellan walked to where the man knelt beside his dying daughter. He looked at Whitmore. He could see the shame, the fear, the exhaustion, the complete collapse of everything that had once made Harlan Whitmore certain and powerful and dismissive of anything he did not understand. Your daughter needs warmth, Stellan said quietly. She needs it now. Everything else can wait. They worked together through the night, the three of them, Stellan and Lana, and the man who had tried to take their land. They wrapped Della in warm blankets. They gave her sips of heated water when she was conscious enough to swallow. They repositioned her near the pillar as the stone continued its slow, steady release of heat that had been stored hours ago and would persist for hours more. Odin stationed himself near the child. He had not been asked, he had not been directed. The dog simply recognized that a small human needed warmth and protection and positioned himself accordingly, pressing his warm, gray body against the blankets where Della lay, adding his own heat to the pillar's radiance. At 3 in the morning, Della opened her eyes. She looked at the strange room around her, at the massive pillar rising through the center stone that seemed to glow with a warmth she could feel on her face, at the gray dog lying beside her, watching her with calm brown eyes, at her father's face lined with worry and exhaustion and something she had never seen there before. Papa, she whispered, I am warm. Harlan Whitmore, the wealthiest and proudest man in Gallatin County, buried his face in his hands and wept. More came through the night and into the following days. Marcus Treadwell arrived an hour after Whitmore, carrying his wife, who was barely conscious, their corner stove having failed completely when the chimney clogged with ice. He brought news that 3 families were trapped in their cabins, burning furniture to stay alive because their cordwood was gone and the cold was consuming everything combustible they owned. Pastor Jeremiah Crane came at dawn. His face was gray with frostbite. His fingers were white at the tips. He had walked 2.5 miles through cold that should have killed him, following the thin column of smoke rising from Stellan's chimney like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. He had followed it because it was the only sign of life he could see in a world that seemed to have died overnight. The Henderson family came, missing their son, carrying grief so heavy it seemed to compress the air around them, to slow their movements, to make every step an act of will rather than motion. They did not speak of what had happened in their cabin during the night. They did not need to. Their faces told the story. The mother's eyes told the story. The empty space between the parents where a boy should have been walking told the story. Samuel Ironhorse appeared in the way that Samuel Ironhorse always appeared, without announcement, without sound, as if materializing from the storm itself. He brought with him 2 elderly Crow women who would not have survived another night in their shelter. He nodded at Stellan, a simple nod, the kind that passes between men who had recognized the same truth months ago in summer sunlight and were now watching that truth prove itself in winter darkness. By noon on January 11th, 19 people occupied a cabin built for 4. They sat against every wall. They lay on every available surface. Children sat in the laps of adults who were not their parents. Strangers leaned against strangers. The boundaries that normally separated people in a community, the walls of wealth and pride and reputation and grudge and suspicion, all dissolved in the warmth that the pillar provided without discrimination. Stone does not care who you are. Stone does not care how much money you have. Stone radiates to everyone equally. The temperature outside was 44 below zero. The temperature inside, in every corner, at every wall, measured by the thermometers that Angstrom had hung during the October test, read 57 degrees. A differential of over 100 degrees, maintained by Stone. Dr. Phineas Osborne had arrived with the 3rd group, his medical bag empty of anything useful for mass hypothermia, his scientific certainty in ruins around him, like the wreckage of a theory that reality had demolished without mercy. How is this possible, he said. He was not asking Stellan. He was asking the universe. He was asking every textbook he had ever read and every lecture he had ever attended and every assumption he had ever made about what Stone could and could not do. Stone should not hold heat for this duration. This defies what I learned in my training, and yet it works. Old Tobias Angstrom sat near the pillar, his weathered hands pressed flat against granite that had retained heat through the coldest night in memory. He had arrived before the doctor, before the pastor, before most of the others, making his way through the storm with the sure-footed determination of a man who knew exactly where warmth could be found. It works because the boy built what his father designed, Angstrom said. It works because the girl calculated what the books could not teach. It works because 500 years of Swedish engineering went into that stone. You did not believe because you did not understand. Understanding was available to anyone who asked. Most of you did not ask. You assumed. Lana stood before the room. 19 people looking at a 12-year-old girl, grown men who had mocked her brother, women who had pitied the orphans, a doctor who had predicted failure, a rancher who had tried to buy their land for pocket change. This pillar stores enough thermal energy to warm a cabin for 14 hours without additional fire, she said. Her voice did not waver. The ring firebox charges the stone from every direction at once. The central flue extracts additional heat from the smoke as it rises through the core. Every principle works together. No single element is sufficient alone. The mass provides duration. The ring firebox provides uniform charging. The central flue provides efficiency. Together they achieve what no corner stove can achieve. Warmth everywhere. For hours. After the fire dies. She paused. She looked at the faces around her, at the fear and the gratitude, and the shame. You told my brother he was building his own grave, she said. Instead, he built the only thing in this county that could keep people alive through this storm. The silence that followed was not the silence of embarrassment, though embarrassment was present. It was the silence of recognition. The silence that falls when people realize they have been wrong about something that mattered. The silence that precedes change. They lived together for 3 more days. 19 people in a cabin built for 4, sharing food that Stellan and Lana had stored, sharing water melted from snow, sharing warmth that the pillar provided twice daily when Stellan built his fires, and that the stone held through the hours between. Strange things happen when people are confined together by forces larger than their differences. Walls come down, not the cabin walls which held firm, the other walls, the invisible ones that people build between themselves from pride and judgment and the comfortable assumption that they already know everything worth knowing. Beulah Sloan, the woman who had spread gossip about the orphans' foolishness since June, sat beside Lana on the second evening and spoke quietly about things she had never spoken of publicly. She had lost 2 children in the early years of her marriage, stillborn both of them. She had carried that grief in silence for 20 years, and the gossip, she admitted, was how she connected with a community she had never truly felt part of. Talking about others was easier than talking about herself. Judging others was easier than facing her own pain. Jed Sutter, the cowboy who had bet $9 on the pillar's collapse, sat across from Stellan on the second night and spoke with an honesty that alcohol had never produced in him. His bravado covered a terror of poverty that had followed him since childhood. His father had lost everything in a bad winter when Sutter was 7. They had eaten bark. They had burned the furniture. His mother had not survived. He mocked ambition in others because ambition in himself had always been too frightening to attempt. Failure in others reassured him that staying small was the right choice. Pastor Crane confessed that his faith had been shaken by the deaths he had witnessed in Montana. Good people dying pointlessly in a land that seemed designed to destroy them. He had stood over too many graves and spoken words he was no longer sure he believed. But watching the pillar work, watching stone hold warmth through a killing night, watching a boy's faith in his father's knowledge prove justified against every prediction of failure, something had shifted inside him. Not proof of God, perhaps, but proof that belief in something unseen could be vindicated by something real. And for a man of shaken faith, that was close enough. Dr. Osborne asked Lana to explain the physics again. And this time he listened, not with the polished attention of a man waiting for his turn to speak, with the genuine attention of a man who had discovered that his education was incomplete and who wanted for perhaps the first time in decades to actually learn something rather than merely confirm what he already believed. On the 3rd day inside, Della Whitmore spoke her first full sentence since arriving. She had been watching Odin, who had positioned himself as her personal guardian since the moment she entered the cabin, lying beside her through 3 days of recovery, allowing her to stroke his fur with fingers that had regained their color and their warmth and their capacity to feel. "Why does the stone stay warm?" she asked. Lana knelt beside the little girl. "Because stone has a good memory," she said. "When we heat it with fire, it remembers that heat for a long time. Much longer than iron remembers. Much longer than wood remembers. Stone remembers for hours and hours. Like how I remember things, exactly like that. Your mind remembers stories and faces and places. Stone remembers warmth. And when we need that warmth, the stone shares it with us. Della considered this with the gravity that 6-year-olds bring to ideas that strike them as important. That is nice of the stone, she said. Yes, Lana agreed. It is. Whitmore watched this exchange from across the cabin. His daughter, who had been gray and dying 48 hours ago, was now petting a dog and learning physics from the girl whose family he had tried to dispossess. His pride, which had nearly killed his child, had been replaced by something he was not accustomed to feeling. Gratitude, humility, the understanding that he had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered. He stood. The room quieted. 19 people watched the wealthiest man in the county rise to his feet in a cabin owned by the poorest. I owe this family an apology, he said. His voice was rough, not practiced, not polished, rough the way a voice gets when it is carrying something heavy for the first time. I tried to buy their land for a fraction of its value. I called the boy a fool. I said he was building his own grave. He paused. The cabin was silent except for the wind outside and the soft sound of Odin breathing near the pillar. I was wrong. We were all wrong, and we would all be dead now if not for what this family built. He turned to Stellan. The boy stood near the door where he had positioned himself throughout the ordeal, tending fires, managing space, ensuring that 19 people had what they needed without being asked. 17 years old, carrying responsibility that would have broken men twice his age, and carrying it without complaint, without resentment, without a single word of reproach toward the people who had mocked him for months. I am sorry, Whitmore said, for all of it, for the mockery, for the offers, for everything. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about your father's knowledge. I was wrong about everything. Stellan looked at the man. He could have spoken of every cruelty, every dismissal, every laugh. He could have demanded more, a longer apology, compensation, public humiliation to match the private pain. He did not. Apology accepted, he said, and that was enough. On the morning of January 12th, the storm broke. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, like a fist unclenching. The clouds parted. Sunlight touched snow that was piled 5 feet deep in drifts and transformed the valley into something that looked almost beautiful, if you could forget what the beauty was covering. 19 people emerged from the cabin. They stood blinking in light that seemed impossibly bright after days of darkness. They looked at the world the storm had left behind. Trees stripped bare, drifts that buried fences. A silence so complete it seemed the land itself was exhausted. Then they looked back at the cabin, the thin column of smoke rising from the central chimney, the walls that had held warmth while the world froze, the door through which they had stumbled, half dead, and through which they were now walking out alive. Stellan and Lana stood in the doorway. Odin sat between them. They looked so young, so impossibly young for what they had done. 4 people died in Gallatin County during the Arctic outbreak of 1888. The Henderson boy frozen in a corner, 6 feet from a stove that could not reach him. 2 elderly homesteaders who ran out of firewood on the 3rd day. A bachelor found frozen in his cabin, dead in the corner, opposite his stove, 20 feet from warmth that could not bridge the distance. All 4 died because of geometry. Because heat from a corner travels in one direction and diminishes with distance and cannot reach the places where people need it most. But 19 people who should have died did not die. 19 people who had crowded into a cabin built for 4 who had shared warmth that a stone pillar provided without fail, who had lived because a boy built what his father designed and a girl calculated what the torn pages had contained. The aftermath unfolded slowly the way all aftermaths do. The immediate crisis passed. The long consequences began. Harlan Whitmore approached Stellan 1 week after the storm ended. He was a different man than the one who had stood at the back of a funeral 8 months earlier, with his arms crossed and his offer ready. Something had broken in him during the storm, and something else had grown in its place. Not weakness, understanding. I meant what I said inside, he told Stellan. I was wrong about all of it. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch. This is $100, more than I ever offered for your land. It is yours, freely given, no conditions, no expectations. Stellan looked at the money. I did not save you for payment. I know, that is why you deserve it. Whitmore pressed the pouch into Stellan's hands. And when spring comes, I want you to teach me. Teach me how to build what you built. Teach me how to heat a cabin properly. I have 3,000 acres and a dozen men and more money than most people in this territory will ever see, and none of it kept my daughter alive. Your pillar kept my daughter alive. That knowledge is worth more than anything I own. Stellan looked at Lana. She nodded slightly. I will teach you, Stellan said. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. My father's knowledge should not die with him. It should spread. It should help people survive. And it did spread. By the summer of 1888, Stellan had taught the pillar building technique to 7 homesteaders. Not all used granite. Some built with river rock. Others used brick. One rancher constructed a square masonry core because he could not manage the circular design. But all incorporated the core principles. Central placement for equal radiation, maximum mass for extended duration, ring fireboxes for complete circumferential heating. Whitmore was among the first students. He arrived at the Allberg homestead with his foreman and 2 laborers ready to learn what he had mocked for so long. Stellan taught him patiently, explaining each principle the way his father had explained them to him. Whitmore listened. He took notes. He asked questions that showed genuine desire to understand, not simply to replicate. My father built corner fireplaces because his father built corner fireplaces, Whitmore said one afternoon, as they watched his men lay the foundation for a new pillar at his ranch. Nobody questioned it. Nobody thought about whether there was a better way. We just did what had always been done. That is how most knowledge is lost, Stellan replied. Not through ignorance, but through assumption. People assume the old ways cannot be improved. They assume that different means wrong. They stop asking why. Your father never stopped asking. No, he never did, and neither did my sister. She was the one who calculated the flue diameter. She was the one who figured out what the missing pages contained. Without her mathematics, the pillar might not have worked at all. She is remarkable, Whitmore agreed. My daughter Cora follows her everywhere now, asks her questions constantly, wants to understand everything. The pillar at the Whitmore Ranch was completed in September 1888. The following winter proved its worth. Whitmore's family slept comfortably while neighbors with corner stoves still struggled. By 1898, homesteads in the county had incorporated some variation of central thermal mass. By 1895, the number had grown to 23. By 1900, the technique had spread to neighboring counties, carried by settlers who had heard the story of the Swedish orphan and his impossible pillar. Cora Whitmore kept her promise. She became an advocate for what she called Swedish heating, traveling to women's clubs and church groups throughout Montana to explain how central thermal mass could save lives. She never forgot the 12-year-old girl who had taught her physics during the worst storm in 40 years. Stellan Allberg lived 44 more years after the winter of 1888. He never left the homestead his parents had claimed. He expanded it slowly, adding acreage, as neighbors sold or died, building it into a modest ranch that supported a family without making them wealthy. He married in 1896 a school teacher from Helena who had read about the pillar in a newspaper and traveled to see it for herself. She stayed for the pillar. She stayed for the man who had built it. They had 3 children who grew up in a cabin where every corner was the same temperature, where morning meant touching stone that still remembered last night's fire. He built 23 pillars in his lifetime, some for payment, most for the satisfaction of spreading knowledge that had saved lives. He taught the technique to anyone who wanted to learn, never charging for instruction, believing as his father had believed that knowledge which could save people should never be sold. He died in the autumn of 1931, 61 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known what it meant to sleep in a cold corner. Lana Allberg lived even longer than her brother. She became a school teacher, teaching mathematics and natural philosophy to children who had no idea that their instructor had once calculated the specifications for a heating system that saved 19 lives. She wrote a small book self-published in 1912 titled Principles of Thermal Mass for Frontier Construction. It never sold many copies, but the copies that sold were read carefully by people who recognized the value of what it contained. She married a builder she met through Stellan's teaching work, a man who had come to learn pillar construction and stayed to learn her heart. They had 2 children who inherited her facility with numbers and her dedication to practical knowledge. She died in 1962, 87 years old, in a house heated by electricity, but built around principles her father had taught before she could read. Odin the Gray Elk Hound, who had belonged to Niels Allberg and had transferred his loyalty to Stellan after the flood, lived until 1895, 14 years old. Ancient for a dog, but fitting for one who had witnessed so much. He was buried beside the graves of Niels and Astrid Allberg in the small family plot that overlooked the valley where they had built their dreams. Stellan carved the headstone himself. Odin, faithful friend, he kept watch. Samuel Ironhorse returned to the Allberg homestead every winter for 15 years. He brought information about crow construction techniques, and he took back knowledge of Swedish thermal mass. The exchange enriched both traditions, two peoples from opposite sides of the world, discovering that they had arrived at the same truth through different paths. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University came to Gallatin County. They were studying historical heating methods, looking for examples of pre-industrial technology that might inform modern passive solar design. They had heard rumors of something called the Allberg pillar. They found Stellan's grandson living in Bozeman. He showed them the stone on his mantelpiece. He gave them copies of Lana's book. He directed them to the homestead, now part of a larger property owned by descendants of Harlan Whitmore, where foundations of the original cabin could still be identified. The researchers spent 3 months studying everything they could find. Their report, published in 1979, confirmed what Stellan and Lana had known a century earlier. Central thermal mass placement did result in more uniform heat distribution than perimeter placement. Ring fireboxes did transfer heat more efficiently than conventional designs. Massive stone construction did provide extended radiation periods. The report included a section on Lana's calculations. The engineering sophistication demonstrated by a 12-year-old girl in 1887 rivals work produced by professional thermal engineers decades later, the researchers wrote. Her analysis of flue diameter ratios, her understanding of convection dynamics, her calculation of storage and release rates all showed an intuitive grasp of physics that formal education often fails to produce. That she derived these principles from incomplete notes and basic physics texts makes her achievement even more remarkable. The Allberg pillar became a footnote in the history of thermal engineering. A small footnote, easily overlooked, but there for anyone who looked closely enough. The stone on the mantelpiece in Bozeman holds no heat now. It has not been warm in 70 years. The original pillar stood until 1954, when Stellan's grandson demolished the cabin to build a modern home with central heating. The granite was scattered across the property, used for walls and foundations and decorative borders around flower beds, where Stellan's great-granddaughter planted roses every spring. But this one piece was kept. This one stone was carried inside and placed on the mantelpiece and left there, cool and quiet and ordinary, a chunk of gray rock that means nothing to anyone who does not know its story. They found the note in Lana's Bible after she passed. Written in her careful hand, a mixture of English and Swedish, the two languages that had built the pillar and the life that followed it. It said everything that needed to be said. They called it a waste of space. They said stone cannot hold heat through the night. But the massive pillar remembers what the small stove forgets. My brother built what our father designed on, what the Kakalugan builders of Dalarna had known for 500 years. Every corner of our cabin held the same warmth. Every morning we touched stone that remembered yesterday's fire. The Americans burned wood all night and still woke shivering in their far corners. We burned for 2 hours and woke warm everywhere. My grandchildren will build homes with furnaces and radiators and will not need granite pillars rising through their floors. But they will remember that grandmother's cabin had no cold corners, and grandmother touched warm stone every morning of every winter for 67 years. The stone on the mantelpiece holds no heat now, but it remembers when it did. Over 3,000 pounds of granite stood in the center of a one-room cabin and kept every corner equally warm through 67 Montana winters. 2 orphans built it, a boy of 17 with bleeding hands and a girl of 12 with borrowed textbooks and a gray dog who kept watch through it all. Everyone laughed. Everyone was wrong. That is what the stone remembers. That is what we should remember too.